Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Highland County, Ohio. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The disappearance of Thomas and Edward Caldwell has long remained one of the most perplexing, unsolved mysteries in southern Ohio's history. On the morning of November 12, 1908, the Caldwell brothers, aged 28 and 25, set out from their farmhouse near Hillsboro to survey a recently acquired parcel of woodland at the edge of their property. By nightfall, neither had returned. Their absence, initially dismissed as an extended hunting trip, would eventually become the subject of the most extensive search in Highland County's history. What began as concern quickly transformed into dread as days passed with no trace of the brothers. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't just the disappearance itself, but what was discovered in 1978 when a historian researching local land disputes stumbled upon a forgotten collection of evidence that had been improperly filed away for 7 decades. The land where this tragedy unfolded sites in the rolling hills of Highland County, a place of deceptive beauty. The autumn of 1908 had been unusually mild, with crimson and gold leaves clinging to branches well past their typical season. The Caldwell property stretched across 300 acres of fertile farmland, bordered by Paint Creek to the north and dense woodland to the east. These woods, referred to locally as the Patterson Tract, cast long shadows over the eastern fields of the farm, shadows that seemed to grow longer in the weeks leading up to the brothers' disappearance. The Caldwell family had been established in Highland County since the 1870s, when James Caldwell, the brothers' father, purchased 120 acres of farmland approximately 4 miles outside of Hillsboro. James was described by those who knew him as a stern but fair man, respected in the community for his work ethic and business acumen. He expanded his holdings gradually, eventually amassing over 300 acres of productive farmland. A local newspaper profile from 1895 described him as among the county's most forward-thinking agricultural entrepreneurs, noting his early adoption of modern farming techniques and equipment. Thomas and Edward were the only sons among James' 5 children. Their mother, Margaret, had passed away in 1897 after a prolonged illness, leaving James to raise their children alone. The 3 daughters, Sarah, Eleanor, and Mary, had each displayed academic aptitude and attended the women's seminary in Hillsboro, with Mary eventually becoming a school teacher in Cincinnati. Thomas and Edward, however, had remained on the farm, gradually assuming more responsibility as their father aged. A photograph preserved in the Highland County Historical Society, dated 1904, shows the brothers standing stiffly beside a new threshing machine, their expressions serious beneath wide-brimmed hats, eyes shadowed in the harsh sunlight. By all accounts, the Caldwell farm prospered under James's management, with both sons taking active roles in its operation as they came of age. According to tax records from 1905, the farm produced primarily corn, wheat, and tobacco, with a small dairy operation supplementing the family's income. The brothers were known in Hillsboro as quiet, industrious men who seldom participated in town affairs, but were nevertheless regarded as dependable neighbors. The local mercantile ledgers show regular purchases of farming supplies, household necessities, and occasionally technical manuals on surveying and land management, the latter primarily charged to Thomas's account. What few realized, however, was the tension that had been brewing within the family for some time. According to correspondence preserved by James Caldwell's youngest daughter, Eleanor, relations between James and his sons had grown increasingly strained in the years leading up to 1908. The source of this friction appears to have been James's decision to purchase an additional tract of woodland from the neighboring Patterson estate, a transaction that depleted much of the family's savings and incurred substantial debt. Thomas, who had increasingly taken on management of the farm's finances, reportedly opposed the purchase, viewing it as an unnecessary risk. The land in question was a densely wooded area of approximately 75 acres that extended from the eastern edge of the Caldwell property into a steep ravine that locals referred to as the Hollow. In a letter to her sister Mary, dated April 1908, Eleanor wrote, "Father and Thomas engaged in another heated exchange regarding the Patterson Woods. Thomas insists the investment is unsound, given current grain prices, while Father maintains that timber rights alone will justify the expense. Edward, as usual, attempts to mediate, though I sense his sympathies lie with Thomas in this matter. The atmosphere at dinner has become almost unbearable." The Patterson family had owned the woodland since the 1830s, when Ezekiel Patterson, a surveyor from Pennsylvania, had acquired several hundred acres in Highland County during the region's early development. Over subsequent decades, much of the original Patterson holdings had been sold off or divided among heirs, with only the less agriculturally viable woodland remaining in family hands by the early 1900s. Robert Patterson, Ezekiel's grandson, had relocated to Columbus in 1895 to pursue a career in banking, leaving the woodland largely unmanaged. In the summer of 1908, James Caldwell suffered a debilitating stroke that left him bedridden. The event, described in detail in the journal of the attending physician, Dr. Howard Thornton, was severe enough that recovery of speech and mobility on the right side appears highly unlikely. Management of the farm fell entirely to Thomas and Edward, with Thomas assuming responsibility for financial matters while Edward oversaw the day-to-day operations. It was during this period that records indicate the brothers began surveying the newly acquired Patterson tract, presumably to assess its potential for clearing and cultivation. According to the local land registry, the deed transfer was finalized on October 28, 1908, just 2 weeks before the brothers' disappearance. The transaction was witnessed by Hillsborough attorney Daniel Webster, who later recalled that Thomas had seemed unusually agitated during the proceedings, repeatedly questioning whether the mineral rights were explicitly included in the transfer. Webster found this odd, as the region was not known for valuable mineral deposits, being primarily agricultural land. This detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, would later take on profound importance. The morning of November 12th began unremarkably at the Caldwell farm. According to statements given by Sarah Caldwell, the brothers' eldest sister who had returned home to care for their ailing father, Thomas and Edward took breakfast shortly after dawn, before announcing their intention to spend the day surveying the eastern property line. They packed provisions for lunch, took James's Winchester rifle, and departed on foot toward the woods at approximately 7:30 a.m. Sarah recalled that the weather was unusually mild for November, with clear skies and temperatures that had prompted Edward to remark they might extend their survey to include the entire perimeter of the new tract. The last confirmed sighting of the brothers came from Joseph Miller, a farmhand who had worked for the Caldwells for nearly a decade. Miller reported seeing Thomas and Edward walking along the edge of the east field around 8 a.m., Thomas carrying a surveyor's transit over his shoulder, while Edward managed a rucksack and the rifle. Miller noted that they appeared to be engaged in serious conversation, with Thomas gesturing emphatically toward the tree line. He thought nothing of it at the time, as the brothers often discussed farm business while working. When neither brother had returned by nightfall, Sarah initially felt no cause for alarm. It wasn't unusual for farm work to extend well past dark, particularly when surveying was involved. However, as the evening progressed with no sign of Thomas or Edward, she found herself growing increasingly uneasy. The farm dogs, typically calm, became restless after dark, barking towards the eastern woods without apparent provocation. Shortly before midnight, unable to sleep, she walked to the home of their nearest neighbor, William Harrison, to inquire whether he had seen either of her brothers during the day. Harrison had not, but offered to begin a search at first light should they remain missing. By morning, with the brothers still absent and their beds untouched, Sarah's concern had escalated to alarm. She sent Joseph Miller to alert Sheriff Daniel Reynolds in Hillsborough. Reynolds, according to his official report filed later that week, initially treated the matter as a simple case of two grown men extending a hunting trip, perhaps staying overnight in the woods. Missing persons reports for able-bodied men familiar with the local terrain rarely warrant immediate concern, he noted. Nevertheless, he dispatched 2 deputies to accompany Miller back to the farm to begin preliminary inquiries. The deputies, Charles Wilson and Samuel Green, arrived at the Caldwell farm shortly after noon on November 13th. They conducted a cursory examination of the brothers' room, interviewed Sarah regarding their last known movements, and briefly surveyed the farm's eastern periphery. It was at this point that the investigation took its first turn toward the unusual. According to Deputy Wilson's report, upon examining the shared quarters of T and E, Caldwell, several concerning observations were made. The room appeared to have been searched, with papers scattered across the writing desk. A small strongbox, which Miss S. Caldwell identified as belonging to T. Caldwell and typically kept locked, had been forced open, its contents apparently removed. What the deputies discovered upon further examining the brothers' room altered the course of the investigation. According to their report, Thomas Caldwell's strongbox had been forced open, its contents, presumably including the farm's operating funds, missing. A single shell casing was found on the floor near Edward's bed, though no evidence of a discharge could be located within the room itself. Most troublingly, a page had been torn from Thomas's ledger, which he used to maintain the farm's financial records. These findings transformed a missing persons report into a potential crime scene. Sarah Caldwell, when questioned about the state of the room, expressed certainty that the disruption had occurred after her brother's departure, as she had brought fresh linens to the room mid-morning and had noticed nothing amiss. This suggested that someone had entered the farmhouse during the day while she was attending to her father in another part of the house. The realization that an intruder had been inside the home prompted Sheriff Reynolds to treat the disappearance with greater urgency. Sheriff Reynolds organized the first search party on November 14th, comprising 6 deputies and 12 volunteers from Hillsborough. They focused their efforts on the newly acquired woodland, following what appeared to be the brothers' initial trajectory based on footprints leading from the farm. The terrain proved challenging, with the eastern portion of the property descending sharply into Patterson's Ravine, a steep rocky decline that channeled a seasonal stream during spring months. Dense undergrowth and fallen leaves obscured the ground, making tracking difficult. Despite a thorough search that extended until dusk, no sign of the Caldwell brothers was found that day. Over the following week, the search expanded to include neighboring properties and extended farther into the adjacent county. Reynolds requested assistance from Adams County to the east, and by November 18th, over 30 men were systematically searching an area of several square miles surrounding the Caldwell farm. Local newspapers began covering the disappearance, with the Hillsborough Gazette running a front-page story on November 17th headlined, "Local Farmers Missing, Foul Play Suspected." The article noted the suspicious circumstances surrounding the brothers' room and speculated about possible motives for abduction or worse, ranging from robbery to personal vendettas. On November 20th, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a surveyor's transit, confirmed by Sarah to belong to the Caldwells, was discovered abandoned near the edge of the ravine, approximately 1 mile from the farmhouse. Peculiarly, the instrument had been carefully placed on its tripod, as though set up for use, with the brothers' lunch pail resting beside it. The food inside remained untouched. A small notebook containing Thomas's handwriting showed a partial survey map with measurements recorded up to midday. The final entry, time-stamped at 1:17 p.m., was an incomplete sentence. Edward believes he saw someone moving along the ridge to the north, possibly trespassing on the new acreage. We will investigate after finishing this section, though I suspect it's merely one of the patterns. The text ended abruptly. This discovery provided the first concrete timeline of the brothers' final known hours, and suggested that something had interrupted their work suddenly enough that Thomas had abandoned his writing mid-sentence. The reference to movement along the northern ridge gave searchers a new direction to focus their efforts. The careful placement of the transit, however, puzzled investigators. If the brothers had been alarmed or pursued, why would Thomas have taken the time to properly set up the expensive equipment rather than simply carrying it? This detail suggested that whatever interrupted their surveying had not initially been perceived as threatening. The discovery of the transit renewed search efforts, now concentrated on the northern ridge referenced in Thomas's notes. Sheriff Reynolds requested additional assistance from neighboring counties, and by November 22nd, over 50 men were systematically searching the area. The Winchester rifle that the brothers had taken with them was discovered leaning against an oak tree approximately a quarter-mile north of the transit's location. The weapon contained 5 rounds with one chamber empty, corresponding to the shell casing found in the brothers' room. No evidence of the fired round could be located in the vicinity. The rifle's condition provided another puzzling element to the investigation. The weapon was clean and undamaged, carefully placed rather than dropped or abandoned in haste. A single set of footprints led away from the tree heading further north, but the trail was lost among the rocks of the ridge. Despite intensive searching of the area, including the use of bloodhounds brought in from Cincinnati on November 24th, no further trace of either brother was found. As the search continued, Sheriff Reynolds began investigating potential motives for foul play. Financial records showed the Caldwell farm to be modestly prosperous, but carrying significant debt due to the recent land purchase. There were no substantial life insurance policies on either brother that might have motivated murder for financial gain. Interviews with neighbors and acquaintances in Hillsborough revealed no known enemies or ongoing disputes that might have led to violence. The forced strongbox and missing farm funds suggested robbery as a possible motive. But as Deputy Green noted in his report, if simple theft was the objective, why would the perpetrators interfere with the brothers nearly a mile from the house, rather than waiting for an opportunity when the property was unattended? The only notable lead came from William Harrison, the Caldwell's nearest neighbor. Harrison reported that approximately 2 weeks before the disappearance, he had observed a stranger on horseback near the eastern edge of the Caldwell property, apparently studying the woodland through a spyglass. When Harrison approached to inquire about his business, the man, described as well-dressed, and speaking with an accent Harrison took to be Eastern, claimed to be a representative of a lumber company assessing timber resources in the area. Harrison found the explanation plausible enough at the time, though in retrospect he noted that established lumber operations typically sent crews rather than solitary assessors. Unfortunately, Harrison's description was too vague to identify the stranger, and inquiries to lumber companies operating in southern Ohio yielded no information about representatives working in Highland County during that period. As November gave way to December, the search for the Caldwell brothers gradually lost momentum. The first snow of the season fell on December 3rd, effectively ending any hope of finding additional tracks or evidence in the woods. Sheriff Reynolds maintained an active investigation through the winter months, interviewing residents throughout Highland and Adams counties, but no credible sightings of Thomas or Edward emerged. By spring of 1909, the case had grown cold. James Caldwell, still partially paralyzed from his stroke, passed away in April of that year without ever learning what had become of his sons. The farm passed to the 3 Caldwell sisters, who attempted to maintain operations for several years before eventually selling the property in 1915 to a cattle rancher from Cincinnati. The case file remained open but inactive, eventually transferred to county archives as administrations changed and new cases demanded attention, and there it might have remained forgotten among thousands of other unsolved disappearances from the early 20th century had it not been for the curiosity of Dr. Martin Fletcher, a historian researching land disputes in southern Ohio for a monograph he was preparing in 1978. Fletcher, a professor of regional history at Ohio University, had developed a particular interest in property conflicts arising from early survey errors and ambiguous land grants. While examining county records at the Highland County Historical Society, he came across a reference to the Caldwell case in relation to the Patterson land purchase. The brief mention in a probate court record from 1909 noted an unresolved question of ownership regarding the eastern woodland, as neither the missing brothers nor their father had left clear wills addressing the recently acquired property. Intrigued, Fletcher requested access to the original investigation files, only to discover that they had been misfiled decades earlier. The records were eventually located in a storage room at the county courthouse, incorrectly categorized under land disputes rather than missing persons or potential homicides. What Fletcher discovered within those files would revive interest in a case that had been cold for 70 years. Among the documents was a sealed envelope marked Supplementary Evidence, Restricted, that had never been included in the official case report. Inside were several items of profound significance: a partial journal belonging to Edward Caldwell, containing entries from September through early November 1908, a series of letters exchanged between Thomas Caldwell and Robert Patterson, the previous owner of the disputed woodland, and, most significantly, a report from a surveyor hired by Sheriff Reynolds in December 1908 that had apparently been suppressed. Edward's journal, bound in faded leather with many pages missing or damaged by moisture, provided the first intimate glimpse into the brothers' state of mind in the weeks preceding their disappearance. The entries, written in a neat, measured hand, began as straightforward accounts of farm operations, but gradually revealed mounting tension within the household. An entry dated September 7, 1908, read, "Father's condition unchanged. Dr. Thornton offers little hope of improvement. T. has taken complete control of accounts, insisting I focus solely on field work. Discovered him reviewing father's correspondence late into the night. When questioned, he became uncharacteristically defensive." Subsequent entries documented increasing friction between the brothers over farm management and their father's care. Edward noted that Thomas had begun neglecting routine farm tasks to focus on researching the Patterson land, often traveling to the county seat to examine old property records. An entry from September 23rd observed, "T. returned from Hillsborough in a state of evident excitement, though he refuses to share what he discovered. He spent the evening making calculations and examining father's old maps of the eastern acreage. When I inquired about tomorrow's harvest plans, he dismissed the question as temporarily insignificant. I fear his priorities have become dangerously misaligned." Edward's journal painted a disturbing picture of life at the Caldwell farm in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. His entries described increasing tension not just between the brothers and their father over the land purchase, but between Thomas and Edward themselves. According to Edward's writings, Thomas had been acting increasingly paranoid in the weeks following their father's stroke, often staying up through the night with a lantern, watching the edge of the woods from the upstairs window. An entry dated October 30th, 1908, read, "T. convinced someone is trespassing on the new acreage, claims to have seen lights moving among the trees after midnight, insists on keeping the Winchester loaded beside the door. Father would never have approved of bringing firearms into the house." The most troubling entries came in early November, after the land purchase had been finalized. Edward wrote on November 4th, "T. took me into the woods today to show me what he called evidence of intrusion. Led me to a section of the ravine where he claimed the soil had been recently disturbed. I saw nothing conclusive, but nodded agreement to avoid another argument. On our return, he made a strange comment about the original Patterson surveys being deliberately misleading. When I pressed him for explanation, he changed the subject abruptly. His behavior grows more erratic daily." The final entry, dated November 11th, the day before the disappearance, was particularly ominous. T. announced at dinner his intention to complete a detailed survey of the eastern property line tomorrow. insisted I accompany him, despite my objections that the tobacco still needs attention. When Sarah questioned the urgency, he became agitated, claiming there were trespassers with designs on what lies beneath. Later, found him in Father's study, burning what appeared to be old letters. He did not know I observed this. I will accompany him tomorrow, if only to ensure he comes to no harm in his current state of mind. Perhaps away from the house, he might finally explain what has driven him to such obsession. The correspondence between Thomas Caldwell and Robert Patterson revealed another dimension to the land transaction that had not been included in the original investigation. The letters, dating back to early 1908, suggested that Thomas had initiated the land purchase independently, without his father's knowledge or approval. Patterson, then residing in Columbus, had initially rebuffed these overtures, writing in March 1908, "I must reiterate that the wooded parcel you inquire about is not for sale at any price. The land has been in my family for 3 generations, and despite no longer residing in Highland County, I have personal reasons for maintaining ownership. Please respect this decision as final." Yet Thomas persisted, his offers increasing in sum with each letter. A letter dated April 17th showed his growing desperation. "Mr. Patterson, I urge you to reconsider my proposal, which I have now increased to $1,200, a sum well above market value for unimproved woodland. My father's health is failing, and I seek to secure the farm's future before responsibilities fall entirely to me. Your continued refusal without consideration of this generous offer suggests you may be unaware of the property's true nature and potential." Patterson's reply, dated April 30th, took a sharper tone. "Mr. Caldwell, your persistence borders on harassment. I am fully aware of every aspect of my family's land, including matters you imagine yourself to have discovered. I caution you against spreading speculations about the property, as such talk would not be welcomed by certain parties in Highland County. This correspondence is concluded." The exchange fell silent for nearly 3 months, resuming in late July after James Caldwell's stroke. Thomas's approach changed markedly, becoming less direct but more effective. His letter dated July 25th read, "Mr. Patterson, please accept my apologies for any offense caused by previous communications. My father's recent incapacitation has brought clarity to many matters. During a review of his papers, I discovered some interesting historical documents pertaining to the original survey of properties along Paint Creek, including your family's holdings. These include a private journal kept by Aaron Whitfield, who assisted in the 1838 surveys. His entries regarding the eastern ravine on your property contain observations that might interest you greatly. I would be pleased to share these findings in person." By July 1908, following James Caldwell's stroke, the tone of the correspondence shifted. Patterson wrote, "Your mention of certain historical findings on the property adjacent to yours has caught my attention. I would be interested in discussing this matter further, though I must emphasize the need for discretion. There are aspects of my grandfather's activities in that area that have long remained private family matters." A subsequent letter arranged a meeting between the 2 men in Columbus on August 15, 1908. Whatever was discussed at this meeting apparently changed Patterson's position, as by September, negotiations for the sale were underway. The final letters detailed the specifics of the transaction, with Patterson insisting on unusual conditions. The sale would be for the land only, with no mention of mineral rights in the deed. Thomas would sign a separate private agreement, not to disclose anything discovered on the property, and most strangely, Thomas would agree never to sell or transfer the land to anyone outside the Caldwell family. Thomas apparently accepted these conditions, though his final letter to Patterson, dated October 15th, contained what could be interpreted as a veiled threat. "I have agreed to your conditions regarding discretion, Mr. Patterson. However, should any authorities ever inquire about certain activities that may have occurred in the ravine during your grandfather's time, I could hardly be expected to feign ignorance of historical facts already documented elsewhere." Most revealing, however, was the suppressed survey report commissioned by Sheriff Reynolds. In December 1908, as the official search was winding down, Reynolds privately hired Gilbert Thornton, a surveyor and mining engineer from Cincinnati, to conduct a thorough examination of the Patterson Tract. Thornton's report, dated December 28, 1908, contained findings that Reynolds apparently chose to keep from public record. According to Thornton, the densely wooded ravine on the eastern edge of the property contained evidence of previous excavation, concealed by years of natural growth. His measurements and soil samples suggested that at some point in the mid-19th century, a substantial pit or shaft had been dug into the ravine wall, then carefully filled in and disguised. Most significantly, Thornton reported finding traces of mercury in soil samples taken from this area, an element commonly used in 19th century gold refining processes. Thornton's report included detailed sketches of the ravine, marking areas of disturbed soil and unnatural contours in the landscape. One section described a depression approximately 20 feet in diameter that did not align with natural erosion patterns. The circular indentation exhibits uniform depth and evidence of deliberate backfilling with materials not native to the immediate surroundings. Stone fragments found within this fill bear tool marks consistent with mining operations rather than agricultural activities. The strategic placement of mature trees around the perimeter suggests intentional concealment of the site dating back several decades. Most compelling was Thornton's analysis of soil samples collected at various depths within the ravine. Using chemical tests standard for mineral prospecting of the era, he identified not only mercury traces, but also minute particles of gold in several samples. Thornton noted, "While the gold content is minimal and would not justify commercial mining operations by current standards, the presence of mercury compounds in conjunction with gold suggests deliberate extraction attempts rather than natural deposits." The refining techniques evidenced by these chemical markers are consistent with methods employed during the minor gold rushes that occurred in parts of southern Ohio in the 1840s. Operations typically conducted quietly to avoid attracting attention or claim jumpers. Thornton's conclusion was measured but unmistakable. The physical evidence suggests that the site may have been used for unauthorized mining or ore processing, likely during the period of 1840–1855 when reports of gold. Deposits in southern Ohio prompted numerous prospecting ventures. While most such endeavors proved fruitless, the presence of mercury compounds in the soil indicates that someone believed they had found something of value. Whether this activity was conducted with the knowledge of the then property owners remains unclear. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing element of the suppressed file. Thornton reported finding evidence of recent excavation at precisely the same location, work that appeared to have been halted abruptly, and attempts made to conceal it. His report stated, "The fresh tool marks and disturbed soil suggest that within the past few months, someone had rediscovered the original excavation site and had begun to reopen it. The work appears to have been conducted by one or two individuals using hand tools rather than a professional mining operation." Most concerning are the traces of what appear to be blood found on rocks near the excavation site, though the exposed location and intervening weeks of weather make definitive identification impossible. Thornton's report included a final observation that might explain Thomas Caldwell's fixation on the Patterson Tract. "Among the debris near the recent excavation, I recovered fragments of what appears to be an old journal or ledger, heavily damaged by exposure but containing partial entries dated 1847. Though much of the text is illegible, one visible passage refers to a vein richer than any in California and mentions keeping the discovery secret until extraction can be completed. If the Caldwell brother came across similar documentation, it might explain his determination to acquire the property and subsequent activities there." Sheriff Reynolds's decision to suppress this report raises troubling questions about the original investigation. A note in his handwriting attached to Thornton's findings, offers a partial explanation. In consideration of the Patterson family's standing and the absence of conclusive evidence linking this site directly to the Caldwell disappearance, I have determined that inclusion of these findings in the public record would cause unwarranted speculation and potential damage to reputations. The site has been discreetly filled in to prevent accidents or interference with any ongoing investigation. A subsequent note, dated January 1909, added, "After consultation with Judge Wilson, it has been determined that the mineral content of the soil samples is insufficient to justify further inquiry into historical mining activities. All materials related to Thornton's survey are to be sealed and filed separately from the main investigation. No reference to possible gold deposits should appear in any public documents related to the Caldwell disappearance. The implications of these documents, discovered 70 years after the fact, cast the Caldwell brothers' disappearance in an entirely new light. They suggest that Thomas had somehow learned of a potential gold deposit on the Patterson land, information that had been kept secret by the Patterson family for generations. His determined efforts to acquire the property, conducted initially without his family's knowledge, point to motivations beyond simple farm expansion. Edward's journal entries suggest that as Thomas's obsession with the land grew, so too did the rift between the brothers, with Edward increasingly concerned about his brother's mental state and secretive behavior. Dr. Fletcher's discovery prompted a brief revival of interest in the case in 1978. The Highland County Sheriff's Department, under Sheriff William Harmon, conducted a new examination of the Patterson Ravine using modern equipment. According to Harmon's report, filed in October 1978, ground-penetrating radar identified several anomalies consistent with Thornton's century-old findings about a filled-in excavation. However, the intervening decades of erosion, construction of a county road that cut through a portion of the former Caldwell property in the 1950s, and the development of surrounding lands made a comprehensive investigation impossible. The most significant finding from this renewed investigation came not from the ravine itself, but from a small cave discovered approximately 50 feet up the northern ridge, an area that would have corresponded to the direction Thomas noted in his final journal entry. The cave, little more than a narrow fissure in the limestone ridge, had apparently been overlooked during the original search, despite being less than a mile from the farm. Inside, investigators discovered a rusted metal box containing surveying tools consistent with those used in the early 1900s, along with a pocket watch bearing the initials EC, almost certainly belonging to Edward Caldwell. The watch had stopped at 4:17, presumably p.m. given the brothers' morning departure. The cave also yielded fragments of paper that forensic analysis identified as pages from a journal or ledger dating to the 1840s, similar to what Thornton had described finding near the excavation site. Though largely illegible due to decades of exposure to moisture, certain phrases could be made out, including references to the vein and keeping operations quiet. Most tellingly, one partially preserved page contained the line, E. Patterson insists we remove all evidence of the shaft once extraction is complete. The official survey will show nothing but worthless ravine land. Local newspapers covered the revival of the investigation with considerable interest. The Hillsborough Gazette ran a series of articles in late 1978 under the headline "Century-Old Mystery Resurfaces, Gold Fever and Disappearance." Public fascination with the case led to a brief surge of amateur prospectors visiting the area, despite the sheriff's warnings that the land was now private property and that historical evidence suggested any gold deposits had been exhausted in the 19th century. The renewed investigation also brought forward previously unknown witnesses. Martha Collins, then 87, came forward after reading about the case. As a young woman, she had worked as a housekeeper for the Patterson family in Columbus around 1910. She recalled overhearing a conversation between Robert Patterson and his attorney shortly after Patterson had fallen ill. Mr. Patterson was in a terrible state, feverish and frightened. He kept saying someone had disturbed what should have stayed buried, and that his grandfather would never forgive him for breaking the pact. His lawyer told him to calm himself, that the Caldwell matter was resolved and would stay that way. I didn't know what they meant at the time, but it troubled me enough that I remember it clear as yesterday, all these years later. Despite these new developments, the 1978 investigation ultimately failed to determine conclusively what had happened to Thomas and Edward Caldwell on November 12, 1908. No human remains were found in the cave or surrounding area, despite an extensive search. The watch and surveying tools suggested that at least Edward had reached the cave at 4:17 p.m., approximately 3 hours after Thomas's final notebook entry, but what occurred afterward remained a mystery. Sheriff Harmon's final report concluded, while evidence strongly suggests the brothers' disappearance was connected to their discovery of historical mining operations on the property, insufficient physical evidence exists to determine whether they met with foul play, fled the area voluntarily, or suffered an accident in a location yet to be discovered. What actually transpired on November 12, 1908, remains a matter of speculation, though the discovered documents allow for a more informed conjecture than was previously possible. The most plausible scenario, based on the available evidence, suggests that Thomas Caldwell had learned of a potential gold deposit on the Patterson land, possibly from old rumors or documents he had uncovered while managing the farm's affairs following his father's stroke. His increasing obsession with acquiring the property, as documented in Edward's journal, points to his belief that something of significant value lay hidden in the ravine. The brothers' survey work on November 12th appears to have been interrupted when they noticed someone else on the property, possibly another party, aware of the ravine's secret. The abrupt end to Thomas's notes, the abandoned transit, and the rifle left leaning against a tree suggest a confrontation or pursuit, rather than a planned departure. The presence of Edward's watch in a cave some distance from their last known location indicates that at least one of the brothers fled or was taken to that location. The stopped time, 4:17, places this event approximately 3 hours after Thomas's final journal entry. Several theories emerged from the combined investigations of 1908 and 1978. The most straightforward suggests that the brothers encountered trespassers at the ravine, perhaps associates of the Patterson family monitoring the site, or unrelated prospectors who had learned of the potential gold deposit. A confrontation ensued, resulting in violence that left the brothers dead or severely injured, their bodies concealed somewhere in the expansive woodland or perhaps in the old mining shaft itself before it was filled in. A more complex theory proposes that Thomas and Edward discovered evidence of not just historical mining, but of something more sinister. The presence of mercury, while consistent with gold refining, was also associated with certain industrial processes that would have been illegal or regulated even in the early 20th century. The Patterson family's determination to keep the ravine's secrets hidden might have stemmed from fear of legal repercussions or environmental contamination that could have led to liability. Under this theory, the brothers were silenced to prevent exposure of corporate or family crimes extending back decades. A third possibility, considered less likely but not dismissed entirely, is that the brothers themselves orchestrated their disappearance. If Thomas had indeed discovered gold or other valuable minerals in quantities worth extracting, he might have decided to abandon the farm and its debts to secretly mine the ravine. The disrupted room and missing funds could have been staged to suggest foul play, while the brothers established themselves elsewhere under new identities. The bloodstains found near the excavation site complicate this theory, but could potentially be explained as coming from an injury sustained during their work rather than a fatal wound. The Patterson family's reluctance to sell land that contained evidence of illicit mining activities, followed by their sudden reversal after Thomas mentioned historical findings, suggests the family had been concealing something for generations. Reynolds's concern for the Patterson family's standing implies that revealing the truth might have implicated prominent members of the community in either past wrongdoing or the brothers' disappearance. What became of the Caldwell brothers themselves remains the central mystery. The absence of bodies, despite extensive searches at the time and again in 1978, leaves their ultimate fate uncertain. Local folklore that emerged in the decades following their disappearance included rumors that they had discovered gold and fled with it, or that they had been silenced to protect old secrets. A more mundane but equally plausible explanation is that they met with foul play in a remote area where their remains were never discovered, or were disposed of in a manner that prevented discovery. The 1978 investigation yielded one additional piece of evidence that further complicated the narrative. In the county coroner's archived records from 1908-1909, Dr. Fletcher discovered a report concerning an unidentified male body found in the Paint Creek watershed in March 1909, approximately 5 months after the Caldwell's disappearance and 10 miles downstream from their property. The body, severely decomposed and damaged by winter conditions, was estimated to be that of a man in his 20s or 30s. Most notably, the report mentioned a peculiar gold signet ring found on the body's right hand, which was never claimed or definitively identified. Sarah Caldwell had been shown this ring in 1909, but could not positively identify it as belonging to either of her brothers. The coroner's sketch of the ring showed an unusual design, what appeared to be a surveyor's transit, overlaid on a topographical pattern. No such ring had been mentioned in the inventory of the brothers' personal effects, nor did any family members recall either brother owning such an item. The body was eventually buried in the county cemetery under a marker reading simply, "Unknown Man, 1909. In light of the revived investigation, Sheriff Harmon attempted to locate this grave for potential exhumation and modern forensic analysis, but cemetery records from the period had been damaged in a courthouse flood in the 1937, making precise identification of the plot impossible. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the likely area revealed several unmarked burials, but without the ability to identify which might contain the remains in question, no exhumation was authorized. Another intriguing document emerged during the 1978 investigation, a letter sent to Sheriff Reynolds in February 1909 from a Robert Wilson of Cincinnati. The letter, which had been filed separately from the main case, stated, "Having read accounts of the missing Caldwell brothers in your county, I believe I may have encountered one of these gentlemen in January. A man identifying himself as Edward Caldwell took lodging at my boarding house for approximately 1 week. He appeared nervous and ill, keeping to his room except for brief outings. He spoke of a brother who had remained behind to settle matters and mentioned plans to travel west. What prompted this communication was his sudden departure, leaving behind several personal effects, including surveying instruments and a journal containing calculations and maps. Should these items be of interest in your investigation, I would be pleased to forward them to your office." Reynolds' response attached to the letter was terse. "Thank you for your information regarding the Caldwell matter. After consideration, I do not believe the individual you encountered was connected to our case. No further action is necessary on your part." No record exists of Reynolds following up on this potential lead, and the items mentioned were never added to the case file. Whether this represents a legitimate sighting of Edward Caldwell having survived whatever transpired in November 1908, or merely a case of mistaken identity or opportunism, remains impossible to determine. The Caldwell farm itself passed through several owners in the decades following the sisters' sale of the property. The Patterson Ravine was partially filled during the construction of County Road 73 in 1952, altering the landscape that might have held answers. By 1978, when Dr. Fletcher's discoveries renewed interest in the case, the original farmhouse had been demolished, replaced by a modern residence whose occupants knew nothing of the property's haunted history. The woodland where the brothers vanished had been significantly reduced, with only about 20 acres of the original Patterson tract remaining undeveloped. This remnant, now bordered by suburban housing developments, became the subject of a contentious zoning dispute in 1980 when a developer sought to clear the land for additional homes. Citing the historical significance of the site, the Highland County Historical Society successfully petitioned for its preservation as a nature reserve, ensuring that whatever secrets might still lie beneath the soil would remain undisturbed. In a final, eerie postscript to the case, Dr. Fletcher's research notes indicate that Robert Patterson died under mysterious circumstances in December 1908, barely a month after the Caldwell brothers' disappearance. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch cited complications from pneumonia, yet Fletcher discovered a private physician's report suggesting Patterson had been exhibiting symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning in the weeks before his death. The physician noted patient displays tremors, oral inflammation, and neurological symptoms inconsistent with typical pneumonia. When questioned about possible exposure to toxic substances, he became agitated and refused to elaborate. Whether this was coincidence, evidence of his own exploration of the ravine's secrets, or something more sinister, remains yet another unanswered question in a case defined by its shadows. Fletcher's monograph on land disputes, published in 1980, included a chapter on the Caldwell case that drew significant attention within academic circles. His work prompted several subsequent researchers to examine similar patterns of mysterious disappearances associated with historical mining operations throughout the Ohio Valley. A geological survey conducted in 1982 confirmed that the limestone formations in Highland County did indeed contain trace gold deposits, not enough to be commercially viable with modern methods, but potentially attractive to 19th century prospectors using more labor-intensive techniques. The Highland County Historical Society maintains a small exhibit on the Caldwell case, displaying copies of the original newspaper articles, photographs of the farm and the brothers, and a replica of Edward's pocket watch, permanently set to 417. A map shows the original boundaries of the Caldwell farm and Patterson woodland, now overlaid with modern roads and developments. Visitors often remark on the strange atmosphere that still pervades the remaining woods, particularly in late autumn, when the light filters through bare branches and casts long shadows across the ravine. Local residents have reported unusual occurrences in the vicinity of the old Patterson tract over the decades. Several homeowners along the edge of the preserved woodland have documented unexplained sounds, methodical tapping or digging noises that seem to emanate from the ground itself, typically heard in the pre-dawn hours of late autumn. Others have reported seeing lantern-like lights moving among the trees, always in pairs, visible briefly before disappearing behind the ridge. While skeptics attribute these phenomena to wildlife, teens playing pranks, or the power of suggestion fueled by knowledge of the area's history, those who have experienced them firsthand often speak of an accompanying sense of dread that defies rational explanation. In 1998, 90 years after the disappearance, construction workers excavating for a water main near the edge of the preserved woodland uncovered what appeared to be an old wooden chest, badly deteriorated and filled with soil. Before archaeologists could properly examine the site, heavy rains caused a collapse that buried the chest again. Budget constraints and permit issues prevented further excavation, leaving yet another tantalizing possibility unexplored. The most recent development in the century-old mystery came in 2005, when a retired surveyor named Harold Whitfield contacted the Highland County Historical Society with an intriguing family document. Whitfield's great-grandfather, Aaron Whitfield, had been mentioned in Thomas Caldwell's correspondence with Robert Patterson as having assisted with the original 1838 surveys of the area. The document, a personal journal kept by Aaron Whitfield, contained entries spanning from 1838 to 1850, including several references to the Patterson property. One entry, dated June 1847, was particularly revealing. E. Patterson has requested alteration to the official survey of the Eastern Ravine. Claims error in my original measurements, though I know them to be accurate. Offered substantial compensation for the adjustment. After consultation with J. Miller, have decided to accommodate the request given the isolated nature of the parcel and its unsuitability for agriculture. Patterson assures me the matter is one of family pride regarding total acreage rather than any material concern. Have my doubts about this explanation, but see no harm in the amendment. A later entry from October 1849 suggested Whitfield had discovered the true reason for Patterson's request. Encountered unusual activity in the Eastern Ravine while hunting, evidence of excavation and unfamiliar men working under cover of darkness. Recognized E. Patterson supervising the operation. When spotted, he approached and spoke candidly of a modest gold deposit discovered during spring flooding. Swore me to secrecy, citing fear of a disruptive rush should news spread. Explained the survey alteration as means to keep the site inconspicuous in county records. Offered partnership, which I declined, wanting no part of such secretive dealings. Have kept this confidence until now, recording it only for my private recollection. These journal entries provide the missing context for the Caldwell brothers' story. Confirmation that the Patterson family had indeed discovered gold on their property in the 1840s, had deliberately obscured its existence in official records, and had maintained the secret for generations. Thomas Caldwell, through whatever means, had uncovered evidence of this old secret and leveraged it to acquire the land, perhaps intending to extract whatever wealth remained hidden in the ravine. Whether greed, fear of exposure, or some other motive led to the brothers' disappearance remains speculative, but Whitfield's journal removes any doubt about what drew Thomas to that particular parcel of land with such determination. The land that once comprised the Caldwell farm and the adjoining Patterson tract now lies beneath suburban development and commercial properties on the outskirts of modern Hillsboro. Paint Creek still winds its way along what was once the northern boundary of the farm, and portions of the woods remain, though greatly diminished. The exact location of the ravine that may have held the secret that cost two brothers their lives has been altered by decades of development, erosion, and natural growth. Its original contours now difficult to discern even for those familiar with the historical maps. Yet the case continues to resonate in the collective memory of Highland County. The Hillsboro Historical Society hosts an annual lecture on the Caldwell disappearance, attracting history enthusiasts and mystery buffs from throughout the region. Amateur sleuths occasionally appear in the county archives, requesting access to the case files and related documents, hoping to discover some overlooked detail that might finally resolve the century-old questions. Local schools include the story in their Ohio history curriculum, using it to illustrate both the importance of historical preservation and the ways in which past events continue to shape community identity. In 2008, on the 100th anniversary of the disappearance, the Historical Society installed a small memorial plaque at the entrance to the nature preserve that now occupies the remnant of the Patterson woodland. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of Thomas and Edward Caldwell, who ventured into these woods on November 12, 1908, in search of truth and never returned. May their story remind us that the past is never fully buried and that some mysteries are meant to endure." The ultimate fate of the Caldwell brothers remains unknown. No definitive evidence has ever emerged to confirm whether they met with violence, suffered an accident, or chose to disappear. The gold that likely motivated their fateful survey, if any remained in the ravine by 1908, has never been found, at least not officially. The Patterson family line died out in the 1960s, taking whatever additional knowledge they might have possessed to the grave. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this enduring mystery comes from Edward's final journal entry, written the night before he and his brother vanished. Some truths lie buried for good reason, Yet the human spirit cannot resist the urge to uncover what has been hidden. Tomorrow we will continue our search for better or worse. I only pray that whatever we find brings clarity rather than greater darkness. For modern visitors to Highland County who know the story, the remaining woodland at dusk can still evoke an uncanny sensation, a feeling that beneath the surface of the ordinary landscape, unseen currents of history continue to flow. The rustling of leaves might momentarily sound like footsteps. The call of a distant bird might be mistaken for a human voice. And on quiet nights, local residents occasionally report seeing lights moving among the remaining trees, as though someone is still searching for something long buried, an echo of a mystery that, even after more than a century, refuses to remain hidden in the darkness of the past. On particularly still autumn evenings, when the mist rises from Paint Creek and settles in the low areas where the ravine once cut deeply into the earth, one might stand at the edge of the preserved woodland and sense a palpable weight to the silence, a silence that seems to hold back words unspoken and truths unrevealed. It is in such moments that the thin veil between past and present feels most permeable, and the vanishing of the Caldwell brothers seems not a distant historical curiosity, but a wound in the fabric of the place that has never properly healed. In the end, the vanishing of the Caldwell brothers stands as a testament to how the past is never truly buried, how secrets thought long forgotten can resurface generations later. Though the principals in this dark tale have long since passed away, the questions they left behind continue to resonate. What was hidden in Patterson's Ravine? What did Thomas Caldwell discover that made him so determined to acquire that land? What happened to the brothers on that November afternoon in 1908? And perhaps most troublingly, who else might have known the truth and chosen to keep it hidden? Some cases, it seems, are destined to remain in that unsettling territory between solved and unsolved, where evidence points to answers that remain just beyond our grasp, where certainty dissolves into conjecture, and where the absence of closure becomes its own kind of haunting. The Caldwell brothers' disappearance is one such case, a void in the historical record that, even when partially illuminated decades later, refuses to fully reveal its secrets. Perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate, because it speaks to our fear of those things just outside our understanding, to the secrets that lie beneath familiar ground, and to the knowledge that even the most ordinary places may harbor extraordinary darkness. For the residents of Highland County, Ohio, the story serves as a reminder that history is not always what it appears to be, that beneath the surface of rural tranquility may lie currents of greed, desperation, and violence that occasionally break through, only to be smoothed over again by the passage of time. The Patterson Ravine has been filled in, the Caldwell farmhouse demolished, and those who might have known the truth have long since passed away. All that remains are fragments, a pocket watch stopped at 4:17, traces of mercury in the soil, an incomplete sentence in a surveyor's notebook, and the enduring question of what happened to Thomas and Edward Caldwell on that autumn day in 1908. In the silence that follows such stories, in the unanswered questions and unresolved tensions, we perhaps come closest to understanding the true nature of fear. Not the sudden shock or graphic horror, but the slow, creeping dread of knowing that something fundamental has been disturbed and can never be set right. The Caldwell brothers vanished into that silence over a century ago. Their footsteps have faded, their voices have been lost, but the shadow they cast remains a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured.